Where are you watching from? Midnight? 2 in the morning? Somewhere between half asleep and fully feral? You're in the right place, and go ahead, dim the lights. Turn your screen brightness down, let the modern world dissolve just a little. Because tonight, we're going somewhere older than time zones, older than temples, older than the word history itself. This is your quiet corner of the internet where we tell stories the way your ancestors would have wanted them, slowly, symbolically, and surrounded by imaginary firelight. If you like long, poetic storytelling about forgotten humans, buried gods, and prehistoric rhythms, this might just be your new nighttime ritual. So settle in. This is not just a documentary, it's a sleepcore history of what life really felt like before the first cities were even an idea. And if you'd like to support more slow, mythic storytelling for tired sapiens, a like and subscribe is always appreciated. No pressure, no algorithm panic, just quietly helpful. Now, let's begin. You wake before the sun does. Not because you're anxious, not because there's a meeting, not because of some glowing rectangle screaming in your pocket. You wake because the fire beside you has shrunk to embers, and someone needs to feed it before the cold seeps in. The sky above is still a deep, bruised blue. The air smells like ash, hide, and dew. You stretch inside a shelter made of bent willow and stretched animal skin, its walls breathing faintly with the wind. There are no clocks, no alarms, but the rhythm of the night fading into morning is so familiar it lives inside your bones. This is not a rare camping trip. This is your life, and has been the life of your ancestors for tens of thousands of years. It is around 10,000 years before the so-called Common Era. There are no cities, no empires, no governments, no temples, no roads. The wheel has not been invented. The only architecture is firelight and memory. And yet, across what we now call the Levant, Eastern Africa, Europe, and Asia, small groups of Homo sapiens stir beside flickering hearths, speaking the language of smoke, kin, and survival. These are not cavemen, despite what the cartoons told you. In fact, caves are rare. Most humans at this time live in open-air shelters, in mobile bands of 20 to 30 people migrating with the seasons, following the animals, the plants, and the water. They carry everything they need. Stone tools, gut-stitched baskets, sinew-bound spears, dried roots, dreams. The world is wild but not unfamiliar. In fact, it is deeply known. Let us go quietly into one of these mornings. There is a settlement on the northern shore of a lake. The place is now called a Harlow II, located in modern-day Israel. But to the humans who lived here 23,000 years ago, it is simply the place of water, reeds, birds, and fish. The people wake to the cries of cranes and the murmur of insects. Their shelters are brush huts, low dome-shaped constructions of branches and thatch. Inside you find carefully organised living spaces, grinding stones in one corner, fire in another, ash swept to the side, sleeping mats made of woven grass. Nearby are animal bones, mostly gazelle and wild boar. The hearth still glows warm. Someone left embers buried under ash overnight, not by accident, but through expertise. Making fire from scratch is hard. Keeping it alive is a skill. Here, fire is not just warmth or cooking, it is the centre of everything. Where there is fire, there is life. Where there is smoke, there is safety. Another group farther north, near what is now the Czech Republic, wakes under a different sky. At Dolní Věstonice, over 30,000 years ago, humans lived near the edge of an ice age. Their shelters were more complex, mammoth bone structures insulated with clay, furs and turf. Here, among the Lewis Hillies, the people not only hunted mammoths and reindeer, but created ceramics, the earliest known fired clay figurines in the world. Small, abstract, often female. We do not know what they meant, but we know they were shaped deliberately. They were placed in hearths and kilns and sometimes exploded during firing. Were they offerings, or early expressions of identity, fertility, or memory? The point is, this was not a brutal, thoughtless world. This was a place where art already existed, and it existed beside the fire. The structure of daily life was not chaotic. It followed the sun, the seasons, and the needs of the group. In the morning, the oldest and youngest might remain near the camp, tending the embers, drying fish, preparing fibres, repairing nets. Others might leave in small groups to forage, for wild barley, nuts, berries, tubers. These women and the men were botanists without books. They knew what sprouted first after rain, what root needed roasting to be safe, what plant could quiet a stomach or slow a bleeding wound. They walked barefoot, but with a map in their heads not of roads, but of relationships. between plants, rivers, birds, and time. The idea that these people were less intelligent than modern humans is not only arrogant, it is archaeologically false. Their brains were our brains. Their lives demanded knowledge, memory, and cooperation on a scale most of us could not sustain. The younger adults and older teens, those strong enough to run, track, and endure, might set off to hunt. They would follow the signs, a broken twig, a hoof print, the smell of urine in the wind. Their weapons were simple but not crude. By this period, humans were using microliths, tiny stone blades set into wooden shafts like barbed teeth. Some had developed spear throwers called atlatls, which increased force and distance. Bow and arrow would come later. Still, the hunt was not a daily success. In fact, most meals came from plants, not meat. Hunting was prestigious, dangerous, and unpredictable. But when it worked, it fed the whole band. Midday was for mending, drying meat, sharpening tools, passing stories to children who watched everything and asked questions about nothing. There was no school, but learning was constant. Through mimicry, repetition, small corrections, and ritual, children were not separated from adults. They watched their parents nap flint and gut fish. They knew which bark peeled easily and which ants could bite through bone. They learnt the names of stars not as science, but as story. This was a world without written language, but not without history. Memory was the sacred library of the group, and everyone contributed. Let us step now into a shelter in what is today South Africa. In Blombos Cave, around 75,000 years ago, humans etched geometric patterns onto pieces of ochre. One piece has a crosshatch design, lines intersecting lines in deliberate order. Another artifact, a shell bead, has a drilled hole for threading. These are not random marks, they are symbols, which means these people were already thinking abstractly, symbolically, maybe even spiritually. They knew how to transform the world into meaning. We do not know what the symbols meant, but we know they were made with intention and shared. As evening returns, the hunters drift back to camp, maybe with meat, maybe with a story about the one that got away. The gatherers return with baskets of roots and greens. Children play near the hearth, chasing insects or shaping mud into figurines. There is no dinner table, no silverware, but there is food shared communally. There is warmth, there is breath, and there is the fire, now glowing again, fanned to life with bark and bone. Around it the group gathers. Someone hums, someone else taps a stick against a stone. Someone begins to speak slowly, and the children quiet. This is the true Paleolithic cathedral, the circle around the flame. At sites like Dolny-Vestonse, archaeologists have found bone flutes with finger holes. They produce tones that fit modern musical scales. These people made music not for profit, but for presence. They likely danced. They mimicked animals. They told origin stories. They remembered their dead. They named the stars. They may have entered trance states through rhythm fatigue or hallucinogenic plants to speak with spirits or ancestors. Whatever they believed, they enacted it together. Not in temples, but under some sky. Not on altars, but in rhythm. Sleep would come slowly, not from exhaustion, but from satiation. The group would curl near the embers, wrapped in hides, lulled by the sound of breath, wind, and whatever stories remained unfinished. There was no door to lock, no distant siren, but there was safety not from solitude, but from closeness, from being embedded every night in the same warmth, the same sounds, the same watchful eyes. If a predator came near, someone would know. If a child cried out, someone would stir. This was not utopia. There was danger, loss, disease, but it was also not a world of constant scarcity. The archaeological record from isotope analysis of bones to remains of seeds and tools suggests a diet more diverse and more nutritionally sound than that of the early farmers who would follow. The people of this time were lean, strong and deeply mobile. They lived within the land, not above it. This was the end of a long era. For more than 95% of human history, we lived like this, wandering, gathering, hunting, laughing, aching, singing, repairing, remembering. Everything was slow not from laziness, but from necessity. Everything had a rhythm not from superstition, but from attunement. Time was not counted, it was felt. And then something shifted. Not overnight, not everywhere. But the balance began to change. Groups stayed longer in one place. They returned to the same camps season after season. They began to tend wild plants. They began to notice that seeds dropped near camp would grow. They began to settle, And when they settled, they stopped wandering. And when they stopped wandering, they began to measure. The future was no longer a return, it became a projection. Time hardened, so did the soil, and so did the stories. But that comes later. For now, in this moment, in this morning, 10,000 years before cities, there is still only this: the smell of smoke, the taste of bitter root, the warmth of another human beside you, the slow waking of a world that has not yet been fenced. Before kings, before clocks, before gods, there was this: a life shaped not by stone walls, but by a flickering fire and the memory of how to tend it. They did not have notebooks, they did not use spreadsheets, they did not record seasonal variations in bark thickness or animal migrations in leather-bound journals with bookmarks made of bone. But the people of 10,000 years before the Common Era knew the land more intimately than most of us know the rooms we live in. They moved through forests, across riverbanks, along windswept plains, not with a sense of domination, but with the fluency of long familiarity. Their lives did not extract from the earth, they conversed with it. Which berries appeared first after the melt? Which tubers released toxins unless boiled twice? Which birds called before rain? Which mushrooms grew only where lightning had once touched soil? They did not memorize this to pass a test. They lived it because to not know was to not eat. To not eat was to not survive. For the Paleolithic human, knowledge of the land was not a hobby. It was inheritance, apprenticeship and devotion. And the strange thing is this: they remembered all of it. For hundreds of thousands of years, Homo sapiens survived in environments ranging from snow-choked tundra to equatorial jungle, not by building machines or stockpiling grain, but by knowing, deeply bodily knowing. They knew plants not as labels, but as relationships. They knew stones not as objects, but as future tools. They knew the land not as scenery, but as story. And that story was passed from mouth to ear, hand to hand, season to season. Modern archaeology offers us glimpses into this world. Not through books, but through microscopic traces. A single tooth from a woman who died 30,000 years ago can tell us what she chewed. Scraps of pollen on a flint blade can tell us when it was last used. Residue caught in the grooves of a grinding stone can reveal which seeds were crushed on it, and which ones were discarded. These are not guesses. These are chemical footprints, verified and peer-reviewed, that show a stunning truth. The Paleolithic world was not one of brutal scarcity. It was a buffet, a wild, unplanted, uncultivated abundance. And humans learned to read it like scripture. The stereotype says men hunted while women gathered. Reality says it was complicated. Yes, males often focused on larger game, particularly in environments where strength and coordination aided the kill. But women were not passive pickers of berries. They were the ecological anchors of the group. They knew where the edible plants grew, yes, but also which trees healed wounds, which roots induced vomiting, which barks numbed pain. They understood the seasonal choreography of plants, when to harvest before the seeds grew bitter, when to dry leaves for winter, when to follow bees to find sweetness. Their knowledge was not linear. It was a living map, one you walked, sang, and handed down. Studies of dental calculus, the hardened plaque on ancient teeth, have revealed extraordinary details. At sites like El Cedrón in Spain, humans who lived 49,000 years ago carried traces of yarrow and chamomile in their teeth. These are not major calorie sources. They are medicinal. That suggests not just consumption, but intent, a choice, a knowledge of properties. Other remains show traces of water lilies, which contain natural psychoactive compounds. Were these chewed in rituals, in pain, in vision? We do not know, but we know it was not random, and we know it was remembered. Then there is the residue on tools, a stone blade found in Border Cave in South Africa, dated to around 44,000 years ago, carried remnants of poison, a compound made from castor beans and other plant extracts. This was likely smeared on arrow tips, which means someone not only knew which plants were toxic, but how to concentrate, combine, and apply them for use in hunting. That is chemistry. That is pharmacology. That is a science grounded in generations of trial, error, storytelling, and survival. Much of this knowledge moved through women, because they spent more time gathering, yes, but also because they were often the ones tending children, nursing wounds, preparing food, observing the slow shifts in the living world while the hunters followed speed and muscle. In modern forager societies like the Hadza of Tanzania or the Juhwansi of the Kalahari, women routinely identify hundreds of edible plant species. Their spatial memory is extraordinary. They can recall specific trees across miles. Their knowledge is not a library. It is a living, walking body of memory. And it matches what we infer from ancient sites, that Paleolithic knowledge was carried in the body through rhythm, touch, taste, repetition. There is no one Paleolithic world, of course. The diets of humans living near the coast of what is now Japan look very different from those roaming the interior of Europe, but everywhere the pattern holds, a sophisticated blend of local knowledge, seasonal movement, and collective transmission. At Ohalo too, in the Levant, archaeologists found traces of over 100 plant species, including wild wheat, barley, figs, and acorns. Some were charred, suggesting cooking. Others were stored. These people were not stumbling around hoping to find food. They were managing the landscape with intention. They harvested before seeds dropped. They gathered before rot. They knew. Some anthropologists now argue that Paleolithic foragers practiced a form of proto-agriculture, not farming but tending, encouraging the growth of useful species by selective gathering, burning certain areas to promote new growth, avoiding over-harvesting. This is supported by evidence in Australia, where Aboriginal firestick farming shaped entire ecosystems for tens of thousands of years. Fire was not just warmth or defence, it was a land management tool, elegant, effective, and deeply rooted in ecological understanding. And all of this astonishing embodied intelligence, it was passed without writing. It moved through story, through song, through watching your mother crush seeds on a grinding stone and knowing when to turn the paste, through walking the same trail every year and remembering the tree that split in last season's lightning, through knowing that this mushroom looks like the one that killed your cousin, but is missing a small red ring. That kind of memory does not live in books, it lives in bodies. This is not to romanticize the Paleolithic world as utopia. There was hunger, there was sickness, there was death. But it is to say this, they were not ignorant. They were not stumbling through darkness. They were tracking stars, mapping rivers, sharing knowledge, managing ecosystems, and telling stories that carried more data than any scroll. Their encyclopedias were their elders. Their search engine was the fire circle. Today, when we think of intelligence, we often mean abstraction, equations, theories, algorithms, but Paleolithic intelligence was situational, sensory, and saturated in meaning. To forget which berry poisoned or which root soothed was to risk your group's survival. So they didn't forget. They remembered everything, and they told it again and again and again until it became the rhythm of their walking, the lyrics of their rituals, the shape of their tools. The world was not wilderness to them. It was relationship. It was kin. And perhaps that is the strangest thing to realize from 10,000 years in the future, that people with no written language, no cities, no schools, and no scientific method still knew more about their local ecosystem than most of us know about our own backyard. That knowledge did not come from conquest. It came from continuity. It came from reverence, and it was carried every morning by feet on the earth, by eyes scanning trees, by hands reaching into soil, by people who had nothing and yet somehow knew everything that mattered. They were not brutes. They were not slow or dirty or grunting caricatures waiting to evolve. They were us, just barefoot, firelit and unburdened by asphalt or screen. The myth of the brutish caveman is one of modernity's laziest stories, a bedtime fable we tell ourselves to feel superior, to justify our fluorescent anxieties and calendar slavery. But the archaeological record says otherwise. The humans of 20,000 years before the Common Era were not aimless scavengers. They were precision tacticians, ecological stewards, social innovators, and artistic engineers of survival. Let's begin with the hunt, because it is here that imagination most often slips into fantasy. The word hunter conjures a lone man with a stone club crouching in the bushes, but real Paleolithic hunting was cooperative, strategic, and technologically sophisticated. At Boxgrove in what is now southern England, humans living around 500,000 years before the present, that's 500,000 years ago, left behind more than just hand axes. They left the shoulder blade of a horse with a clean puncture wound. evidence of a direct spear thrust. This was not scavenging, it was targeted hunting, and it required skill, timing, and teamwork. Move forward in time to Schöningen, in present-day Germany, roughly 400,000 years ago. Here, archaeologists uncovered wooden spears more than 2 meters long, carefully shaped, balanced, and weighted, like modern javelins. Their craftsmanship implies an understanding of aerodynamics. One spear had a sharpened tip hardened by fire. Others were carved from the base of spruce trees, where the grain runs straight and strong. Nearby were the remains of butchered horses. This was not random violence. This was a planned ambush. A group positioned themselves, likely near a watering hole, and waited. One frightened animal meant momentum. The others followed. The humans struck. These early humans had no metal, no motors, no GPS, but they had memory, observation, and astonishing patience. They understood animal behavior not through textbooks, but through generational watching. They mimicked bird calls. They read hoof prints in mud. They knew wind direction, water availability, herd patterns, and escape routes. In cold regions, they tracked reindeer migrations. In warmer zones, they followed wild boar, elk, and even mammoth. The hunt was not constant. In fact, evidence suggests large game was taken only occasionally, with plant foods making up the reliable daily calories. But when the hunt came, it was a drama of choreography, not chaos. Around 40,000 years before the Common Era, something shifted. Tools became lighter, more specialised. In some regions, the atlatl or spear thrower was developed, a carved lever that extended the arm, increasing force and distance. It allowed hunters to launch projectiles with greater velocity, from farther away, reducing risk and increasing accuracy. The earliest known atlatl fragments date back more than 20,000 years, with widespread use appearing in the Upper Paleolithic. Soon after, in some areas, came the bow and arrow, a revolution in range, stealth, and precision. These tools were not intuitive. They required design, testing, iteration. The bow in particular relies on tension, compression, elasticity, and angle, and it had to be taught. You do not invent a bow by accident. You refine it through failure, through mentorship, through memory, which means knowledge was not just personal, it was cultural, and it was shared. Paleolithic life depended on teaching, not hoarding. You taught your sibling to shape the point. You showed your cousin how to bind the sinew. You corrected your child's stance before they hurt themselves. But here is the twist, and it is one modern ears often resist. Despite all the energy required for hunting, gathering, tool-making, and moving with the seasons, Paleolithic people likely worked less than we do. Anthropologists studying modern foraging societies such as the Aiskung of southern Africa or the Aik of South America consistently find that subsistence activities take around 20 to 30 hours per week. That's 4 to 5 hours per day. The rest is spent on rest, rituals, socializing, repairs, and doing what modern economies would call nothing. Of course, survival required effort, but it was not the endless, disembodied labour of post-industrial capitalism. It was embodied, seasonal and communal. Energy out was followed by rest. The world itself provided rhythm. When the sun got hot, you paused. When the rains came, you shifted. When food was abundant, you preserved. When it was scarce, you moved. There were no emails to check at midnight, no side hustles, no artificial urgency. And when the day was done, they had not only survived, they had sung, they had carved, they had danced. The same hands that skinned a gazelle might have painted a reindeer on limestone. The same eyes that tracked movement in tall grass might have noticed the way shadows danced on a cave wall. This was not the world of mindless drudgery. It was a world where work and meaning lived side by side, not in opposition. Let's return to the data. Bone analysis from Paleolithic skeletons shows dense muscle attachments. These people were strong, not because they lifted weights, but because their lives required movement. They squatted, lifted, walked, climbed, and carried, but their joints show less evidence of repetitive stress than early farmers, whose days were defined by grinding grain, hoeing soil, and repeating motions. Farmers got more arthritis, foragers got more fresh air. And what about their brains? Endocranial volume, the internal space of the skull in late Paleolithic humans, averages equal to, or even slightly larger than that of modern Homo sapiens. This does not mean they were smarter in an IQ test sense, but it does challenge any idea of biological inferiority. In fact, they were neurologically modern, capable of language, music, metaphor, math, and memory. The people of the Upper Paleolithic painted in perspective. They played pentatonic scales on flutes carved from bird bone. They buried their dead with red ochre, ivory beads, and care. Not brutish, not simplistic, just unfamiliar. And yet we continue to simplify them, to reduce their complexity to loincloths and clubs. Why? Perhaps because if we took their intelligence seriously, we would have to question our own. If people without ownership, without clocks, without kings or gods could live full, rich, meaningful lives, then what exactly are we doing with all our stuff? If the hunter-gatherer was not a failure on the way to civilization, but a balanced, adaptive, ecologically integrated being, then maybe civilization is not the inevitable arc of progress, but a fork in the path, a choice, a trade. So the next time you picture the Paleolithic hunter, do not imagine a half-dressed brute chasing mammoths with no plan. Picture a strategist, a patient observer, a sculptor of stone, a singer of wind, a collaborator, and someone who knew that survival was not about conquest but cooperation, not about dominance but timing. Someone who knew that the real art was not killing but living, together, without owning anything, just enough. They were not simple, they were precise, and their rhythm, their pace, their presence, their patience, it echoes still beneath the noise waiting to be remembered. They did not divide intelligence into subjects, they lived it. Every adult in the Upper Paleolithic was a botanist, a geologist, a tracker, a meteorologist, and a therapist for their kin, not because it was noble, but because it was necessary. There were no experts. There were only humans whose memory extended not through writing, but through repetition, ritual, and the rhythms of the land. Survival demanded not just strength, but synthesis. You had to know which root burned the tongue and which soothed the fever. You had to feel a change in air pressure and understand it as cloud logic. You had to read tracks in the mud and recognize the limp in a deer's gait, the urgency in its stride, the season in its presence. This was not guesswork. It was applied science lived, breathed, and passed on around the fire. The intelligence of the Paleolithic human is often underestimated because it was generalist. But generalist did not mean vague. It meant integrated. It meant every hand was trained, every sense calibrated. Memory was not stored in libraries. It was stored in scar tissue and soil familiarity. A person who could butcher an aurochs, sew a stitched hide, remember the shape of stars across seasons, and soothe a child's illness with bitter herbs was not less intelligent than a modern specialist. They were more complete. They did not need an app to remind them when berries ripen. They remembered because their lives depended on it. And they passed it on, and not with textbooks, but with demonstration, with gesture, with metaphor wrapped in story. The tools they made were not primitive. They were precise. Take the Levallois technique, named for a suburb of Paris where its products were first identified. Emerging during the Middle Paleolithic, over 200,000 years before the Common Era, it involved preparing a stone core so that a single flake of a specific shape could be struck off. This required forethought, symmetry, and a deep knowledge of fracture mechanics. This was not trial and error. It was blueprint thinking without blueprints. It was engineering through tactile calculus. You had to imagine the flake before it existed. You had to understand force without measuring it. The tools became more elegant still. In the Upper Paleolithic, around 25,000 years ago, humans across Africa, Europe, and Asia began creating microliths, tiny stone blades less than a few centimeters long. These were embedded into wood or bone to create composite tools, spears with serrated edges, arrows with replaceable barbs, knives with specialized functions. This was modular technology. Tools were designed to be repaired, upgraded, adapted. Microliths are the ancestors of Swiss Army knives, of removable blades, of the very idea that function and form could be separated and recombined. This was not savagery. This was design. At Katanga in the Democratic Republic of Congo, bone harpoons dating back more than 90,000 years were found in the layers of an ancient lakeshore. Their barbs were carved with care, perfectly suited for fishing large freshwater catfish. This was not opportunism. This was specialization, based on detailed ecological knowledge. You needed to know the behaviour of the fish, the depth of the water, the strength of the current. You needed to know when they bred, when they fed, and when the water would yield. At Sungir in present-day Russia, around 34,000 years before the Common Era, 2 children were buried with more than 10,000 ivory beads, painstakingly carved and sewn into clothing. Alongside them lay spears, ornaments, and symbols of ritual significance. The precision and patience required to carve such beads each the size of a fingernail implies thousands of hours of focused labour. These were not people working for mere survival. They worked for beauty, for meaning, for legacy. They abstracted not with symbols on paper, but with their hands. And at Gough's Cave, in what is now Somerset, England, human bones were found with marks of both butchery and engraving. Skulls were shaped into cups, arms and thighs were etched with zigzag patterns. This was not mindless violence. It was ritual practice, perhaps tied to ancestor veneration, grief or memory. Abstraction lived not just in decoration, but in transformation, in taking the human form and giving it a second meaning after death. This was cognitive complexity made tangible, a story told in bone. All of this, from harpoon to bead, from spear point to flute, emerged not from a theoretical mind, but from a hand that repeated, refined, remembered. Abstraction begins in material intimacy. It begins when you strike a stone the wrong way and ruin a week's work, then learn. It begins when you notice that sinew flexes more cleanly if soaked overnight. It begins when you learn that fire changes colour when burning particular resins. These were experiments, repeated daily, across generations. The Paleolithic was a laboratory without walls, a university without books. Every family was a research institution, every campfire a seminar. Music too was not absent. It simply did not survive. But here and there, hints emerge. In Geisenkloster Cave in Germany, fluters made from vulture bone and mammoth ivory were discovered, dating back over 40,000 years. The spacing of the holes aligns with known musical scales, including pentatonic arrangements. These were not random pipes. They were tuned instruments requiring knowledge of pitch, acoustics, and breath control. The maker of such a flute had to understand not just shape, but sound. The listener had to understand not just notes, but meaning. Song requires syntax, rhythm requires repetition. Memory is melody's ancestor. In every carved line and smoothed edge we see abstraction at work. Not abstraction as philosophy, but abstraction as process, as discipline. Paleolithic humans did not need to invent algebra to think mathematically. They practiced geometry in every thrown spear, every shaped core, every symmetrical ornament. They understood material properties not in theory but in tactile memory. The way antler bends before it breaks, the way bone shatters under pressure, the way a blade glides better if flaked in a curve. They also knew the sky. Astronomical markings found on bones and cave walls suggest lunar tracking, seasonal awareness and cosmological thinking. The so-called Venus of Lausel holds a horn with 13 notches possibly representing lunar months. Other sites show tally marks aligned with solstices. These were not calendar makers in the modern sense. But they understood time through cycles, through watching, through living in synchrony with what the heavens mirrored on the earth. Their clocks were the bodies of animals, the shape of the moon, the smell of rain. And they were teachers. Knowledge did not belong to individuals, it belonged to the group. Children learned by doing, by being given small knives, small flint cores, and the time to fail. There was no shame in the first broken scraper, only the quiet approval when the angle finally clicked. Learning was performative, communal, and embodied. The elderly were not obsolete. They were libraries, memory keepers, carriers of songlines, trails, plant cycles, and stories that instructed through metaphor. If you did not remember the story, you did not survive the winter. If you did not teach the story, your people forgot how to fish when the river changed. What this means, and what modern minds often forget, is that generalist knowledge is not shallow. It is deep in a different direction. It moves across disciplines without separating them. It connects stars to seasons, plants to illness, tools to story. It weaves a world where you do not need to own anything because everything you need is stored in your body, your community, and your memory. Paleolithic intelligence was not about abstraction divorced from use. It was about abstraction rooted in touch. And in this sense, perhaps they were wiser than us. For in our era of hyper-specialization, we have forgotten how to be whole. We outsource, we segment, we forget. But they remembered. They remembered how stone breaks, how fire flickers, how fish behave, how grief needs a song, and they carved all of it into the world, so we could remember too. The caveman is a myth. Not because humans never stepped into caves, but because the idea that they lived there permanently, grunting under dripping stalactites, is a modern fantasy, part insult, part misunderstanding. The truth is softer, smarter, and far more mobile. Caves were real, but they were Plan B, emergency shelter, seasonal retreat, natural convenience, not cultural default. The real Paleolithic home was built with hands, memory, and whatever the land offered. To understand where we truly slept before walls, we have to discard the romantic ruin of the cave and look at the archaeological record without our modern biases. First, imagine life without permanence. No postal code, no fence line, no lease. Life in the Paleolithic was mobile, seasonal, and pragmatic. People moved with herds, with flowering cycles, with the thaw. Home wasn't a structure, it was a pattern. A shelter shaped by need, then left behind like a bird leaves a nest, not because it failed, but because life moved on. At Terra Amata, a site on the Mediterranean coast of what is now Valle France, traces of constructed dwellings dating back roughly 400,000 years before the Common Era were found embedded in ancient beach sand. These weren't caves, they were huts, long and oval, framed with wooden posts driven into the ground, likely covered with branches, leaves, or animal hides. The evidence comes from discoloration in soil, post-hole alignments, and fire hearth remains centrally located, a classic layout seen again and again across Paleolithic sites. It was simple architecture, yes, but architecture nonetheless. At Mashirik in Ukraine, dating to approximately 15,000 years before the Common Era, things get stranger and more beautiful. Here, humans constructed circular houses out of mammoth bones. Hundreds of tusks, skulls, and long bones were arranged into walls and supports, then likely covered with hides. One structure measured more than 4 meters across and included a central hearth and stone tools arranged by activity area. Bones were chosen for fit and strength. The people who built it weren't stacking bones like bricks. They were engineers, using the strongest materials available in a treeless steppe. These shelters were not just functional, they were intentional. The openings faced prevailing winds. The interior spaces were zoned, one area for sleeping, one for tool production, one for food storage. Ash layers suggest they were used for weeks or months at a time, depending on season, and then they moved on. These were not permanent homes, they were seasonal bases. Think winter cabin, not fortress. Think repeatable blueprint, not eternal monument. In the Pavlovian culture of Central Europe during the Upper Paleolithic, around 25,000 years before the Common Era, archaeological sites reveal a consistent pattern. Clusters of semi-subterranean dwellings partially dug into lesser soil, supported by timber or bone frameworks and covered with sod or hides. These communities lived in environments cold and open, where trees were scarce and mammoths abundant. They adapted. They dug down to conserve heat. They used mammoth bones not as trophies, but as infrastructure. Ivory, antler, and fire-hardened wood joined the architectural toolkit. This was not a culture of caves, it was a culture of movement, a culture of soft-footed presence. Unlike modern housing, which cuts into the land and stays, Paleolithic shelter adapted to it. When the season changed, the people moved and the shelter decomposed or was reused. Some ethnographers call this low-footprint architecture. It leaves little behind, not because it was primitive, but because it was efficient. It was housing as event, not object. The cave, for all its drama, was often too wet, too dark, too smoky. Yes, there are famous exceptions. Lascaux, Chauvet, Altamira. These caves were used, painted, remembered. But even these may have been sanctuaries, ritual spaces, or winter havens, not year-round homes. In fact, most of the beautifully painted cave walls are located deep within systems that would have been inconvenient for daily life. Crawling into narrow, pitch-black chambers with animal fat lamps was not how you put a baby to bed. It was how you met the spirits, the ancestors, the mythic animals. The cave, in this sense, was temple, not tenement. What Paleolithic people needed was flexibility, and that's what their shelters gave them. They used what was around. In forested regions, they bent saplings into domes, covered with leaves and bark. In tundra, they used bones and hides. In wetlands, they built elevated platforms. In some coastal regions, shell middens were reused as windbreaks. shelter was less about ownership and more about function. You didn't decorate it to show wealth. You insulated it to not die. We know this not only from the structures themselves, but from what surrounds them. Fire hearths, waste pits, tool caches, and sleeping areas tell us these homes were lived in. They were sites of childhood, sickness, old age, sex, birth, death. You didn't just survive there. You told stories, mended clothing, invented lullabies, picked lice from your partner's scalp, and watched sparks drift upward into the sky. You looked out of your woven doorway and saw the moon rising, not a neighbour's garage light. These were not stone box, they were memory nests. Paleolithic shelter was also modular. At some sites, archaeologists have found evidence of structures being repeatedly built in the same configuration, like reusable blueprints passed from generation to generation. Circular hearth at centre, sleeping areas arranged radially, entry facing the least wind, tool-making debris in one quadrant. These were patterns, not coincidences, cultural knowledge encoded in spatial design, and probably taught by imitation, the same way you learn where the spoons go in a kitchen today. The mobility of these homes should not be mistaken for instability. On the contrary, their very impermanence was what made them so resilient. When a flood came, you moved. When a herd shifted, you followed. You weren't trapped by foundations, you carried your knowledge, not your mortgage. The dwelling itself became less important than the people who knew how to build it. Skills were the inheritance, not walls. And when you came back to a place when the berries ripened or the salmon ran again, you found the clearing, remembered the alignment, dug the shallow post holes anew. You rebuilt not just the structure but the rhythm. This was homecoming as ritual, not nostalgia for an object, but return to a pattern, a seasonal agreement between human and land. Compare this to the modern concept of housing, which treats permanence as virtue. We dig basements, pour concrete, stack bricks. We measure stability by how long something stays put, but Paleolithic life tells another story. Here, stability was not in structures, but in systems, knowing how to build again, rather than making something last forever. They were not homeless, they were systemically housed. And yet, despite the evidence, the myth of the cave dweller persists, perhaps because it flatters us. The more brutish they were, the more brilliant we feel. If they lived in caves, then surely our suburbs are triumphs. But what if they didn't? What if their homes were more in tune with the wind and sun than our boxed-in boxes? What if mobility was not a lack, but a feature? What if owning nothing made them more free? Because their homes left little footprint, archaeologists have to work harder. But the traces are there. Hearths lined with stone, post-hole patterns and soil discoloration, ash layers, arranged bones, wear patterns on stone floors. The ghosts of domes and huts and hide-covered shelters flicker back into view under scrutiny. And what we find is not poverty, not absence, but design thoughtful, repeatable, responsive design. So the next time you hear the term caveman, picture someone digging post holes in soft, less soil. Picture a woman bending saplings into a dome. Picture a child lashing sinew around a mammoth rib to form a windbreak. Picture hands not fumbling in ignorance, but shaping space with knowledge, with memory, with grace. They slept before walls, and they slept well. There were no calendars taped to cave walls, no school bells, no grade levels, no flashcards with colourful shapes. And yet somehow the species survived. More than survived, it thrived. For tens of thousands of years before the first city, before the first formal schoolroom, before the word childhood had been invented as a stage separate from real life. In the Paleolithic world, time did not divide generations, it wove them together. A child was not a student. A child was a shadow, a small, watching, curious echo, trailing behind older bodies, learning through rhythm, imitation, and presence. This was parenting without clocks, education without curriculum, and still the species remembered. In every Paleolithic band, parenting was not a nuclear project. It was a communal act. Children were not isolated units of possession. They were shared futures, cared for by mothers, siblings, uncles, grandmothers, and unrelated friends. The anthropological term is alloparenting, a system in which caregiving is distributed across the group. But in practice, it simply meant that everyone was watching, everyone was teaching, and everyone was invested. When the child cried, It was not just one mother's problem. When the child learned to weave grass or throw a stone, the pride echoed across the camp. Contemporary hunter-gatherer groups like the Hadza of Tanzania and the San of the Kalahari offer windows into what this looked like in practice. Among the Hadza, infants are rarely put down. They are carried constantly, skin to skin, exposed to all the sounds, smells and conversations of the adult world. Toddlers are not confined or hovered over. They wander, they explore, they return, and older children, usually between the ages of 4 and 7, begin trailing adults in foraging excursions, learning plant knowledge, trail logic and animal sign long before they're formally taught anything. Among the San, storytelling around the fire serves as a nightly education and oral curriculum rich in metaphor, humour, taboo and survival insight. Children do not ask to be entertained. They ask to understand, and they are answered. Archaeological evidence aligns with these observations. At multiple Paleolithic sites, the wear patterns on small tools suggest they were used by young or inexperienced hands. Scrapers, blades and bees bear marks of learning imperfect flake removals, inconsistent pressure, hesitations in the nap. These are not mistakes, they are childhood preserved in stone. They tell us that children practiced alongside adults, learning the fine motor skills of tool production, not in isolation, but in participation. And the presence of healed injuries in the skeletal remains of elderly individuals tells us something just as vital. At Shanida Cave in present-day Iraq, a male Neanderthal over 40 years old, ancient by prehistoric standards, was found with severe cranial trauma, a withered arm, and evidence of blindness in one eye. He had survived for years with these impairments. Someone had helped him, carried him, fed him, cleaned his wounds. This was not an isolated case. Across Upper Paleolithic Europe and Asia, similar burials show signs of long-term survival despite broken bones, degenerative diseases, and even amputations. The group did not abandon the weak, they adapted. This has implications for how we understand parenting and humanity at large. The caregiving instincts were not limited to child rearing. They extended forward into old age and backward into infancy. In a world without formal timekeeping, life was measured in seasons, in skills acquired, in relationships maintained. You did not ask how old a person was. You asked what they knew, what they could do, how many winters they had seen. Elders were not warehoused. They were encyclopedias. Carriers of songlines, foraging routes, and stories that made death less terrifying. To raise a child in this world was to raise them in a living archive. Age segregation, a hallmark of modern education, did not exist. A 6-year-old would be playing with an infant one moment, then sharpening sticks alongside their grandmother the next. In this intergenerational swirl, knowledge transmission was fluid. Everyone was a teacher, everyone was a student. There were no report cards, but there were consequences. If you did not know which berries caused diarrhea, you suffered. If you could not skin a rabbit, you went hungry. The stakes were higher than a test, but the support was stronger than a syllabus. We know from ethnographic studies that children in hunter-gatherer societies learned faster in certain domains than their modern counterparts. Not in arithmetic or writing, but in environmental literacy. A Hadza child can name dozens of plant species by age 10. They can identify animal tracks, remember seasonal fruiting cycles, and mimic the calls of birds with uncanny accuracy. This is not innate. It is practiced, rehearsed, absorbed through exposure and necessity. It is intelligence shaped by the landscape, not by standardized tests. And yet, this intelligence is holistic. It is not purely utilitarian. Alongside foraging skills come moral lessons, stories of trickster animals and ancestral errors, lessons about greed, kindness of Mars, and balance. Among the San, the tale of the mantis and the moon teaches not just cosmology, but humility and impermanence. The child who listens is not just learning a myth, they are learning how to be human. Without clocks, time was learned through pattern, through the shifting angle of light, the rhythm of migratory birds, the flavour of early versus late season routes. Children did not need to be told what time it was. They felt it. The body internalized rhythm long before the mind labelled it. Waking, sleeping, gathering, sharing, these were not slots in a schedule, but pulses in a communal life. To raise a child without time was not to neglect structure. It was to embed structure in the world itself. Even play had function. Children made miniature tools. They mimicked adults. They role-played hunts and plant collection. These games were not trivial. They were rehearsal for life, and they took place in the same physical space as adult work. There was no daycare. There was shared space, shared air, shared story. The camp was a school, a hospital, a home. It was not divided by purpose. It was united by presence. And the children were not protected from death. They saw it, they mourned it, they remembered. Small footprints are found alongside adult ones at burial sites, telling us children were present. Sometimes children were the buried. Their graves often show incredible care beads, ochre, carved figures. A girl at Sungir, buried over 34,000 years ago in Russia, was laid to rest with thousands of ivory beads sewn into her clothing, a symbol of deep cultural investment. She may have died young, but she mattered. What this all tells us is that Paleolithic parenting was not primitive. It was profoundly human. It was responsive, embedded, and emotionally rich. It did not rely on apps or parenting books. It relied on proximity, attention, and collective wisdom. And it worked. It raised generations who survived ice ages, megafauna, droughts, and darkness. It raised humans who painted on cave walls and carved flutes from bone. It raised children who became ancestors and ancestors who became guides. We may not be able to return to this world, but we can remember what it knew, that children learn best, not from instruction alone, but from immersion. That knowledge passed through relationship is more enduring than that passed through authority. That care reel, ongoing interdependent care, is the true bedrock of any culture. So next time someone calls it a primitive childhood, remember, it was not a childhood without learning. It was a childhood without walls, a life raised not by clocks but by kin. When the sun sank beneath the ancient horizon and the sky became a canopy of memory, what emerged was not silence, but a different kind of life, slower, closer, and full of meaning. In the year 10,000 before the Common Era, there were no lamps, no screens, no clocks ticking the minutes towards sleep. But there was a fire. And where there was fire, there was story, and song, and the quiet, rhythmic rituals of remembering. Night was not an interruption, it was the soul of the day, and the hearth was its pulsing heart. For the humans of the late Paleolithic, fire was not merely a tool for cooking or warmth. It was a space, a structure without walls, a circle of safety and imagination. The hearth anchored the night psychologically, socially and cosmologically. Archaeological remains from sites across Europe, Asia and Africa show that fire was central to daily life, and even more so to nightly life. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, evidence of ochre processing dating back more than 75,000 years before the Common Era suggests not just utilitarian behaviour, but symbolic expression pigments possibly used to mark bodies, objects or ritual spaces lit by firelight. In this way, the night became not just dark, but painted. Around the fire, people told stories. Not the kind we know today, with neat arcs and paperback endings, but layered oral tapestries, myth, memory, warning, and wonder woven into one. Firelight cast shadows that danced like animals, like ancestors, like gods. In those shadows, the child learned. The elder remembered. The group became more than a foraging band, it became a culture. Storytelling wasn't a hobby, it was a survival strategy. Knowledge about predators, diable plants, migration patterns, and moral codes was passed mouth to mouth, night to night. The fire was the original archive. But stories weren't the only sound in the darkness. Music drifted through the coals, flutes carved from vulture bone and mammoth ivory like those found at Hohlefels and Geissenklöstel in present-day Germany, dating back over 40,000 years before the Common Era could produce a full range of notes. Their holes were evenly spaced, their bodies curved for resonance. This was not accidental, it was design. It was experimentation. It was joy encoded in breath. Alongside the flutes came drums, lightly stretched animal hides over wooden frames and percussive tools used to keep rhythm. Some researchers believe certain rocks at Paleolithic sites may have served as lithophones, producing musical tones when struck. The night, in short, had a soundtrack. And with that soundtrack came movement. Dancing was not recreational. It was ritual, therapy, communication. In many contemporary hunter-gatherer societies, dance serves as a communal regulator, a way to express emotion, resolve tension and induce trance. The San of southern Africa still perform healing dances around fires. using circular motion, hyperventilation, and rhythmic clapping to enter altered states. If such practices have survived this long, we can imagine their Paleolithic ancestors swaying under the same stars, fire casting flickers across painted faces. Language too deepened around the hearth. Proto-language, the bridge between animal communication and full linguistic abstraction, may have evolved as much in the night as during the hunt. In the dark, subtlety mattered. Whispered signals, mimicry, metaphor. Around the fire, people mimicked animal calls, practiced intonation, shaped sound into symbol. Some linguists suggest that the narrative impulse, the desire to link events into cause and effect, is older than grammar itself. The fire may have been its cradle. And then there was mimicry, not just for speech, but for empathy. Around the fire, people mirrored each other. Expressions, gestures, moods. It was how they synchronized, how they knew when someone was angry, grieving, or joking. This nightly intimacy, repeated across millennia, helped wire the human brain for social cognition. Firelight sculpted faces in ways daylight never could. You learned people by how they looked when lit from below, and those glances taught you who to trust. Repair too happened here. Not just of tools though, yes, stone edges were resharpened, sinew bindings retied, wooden shafts inspected, but emotional repair, psychic maintenance, existential recalibration. The fire heard confessions. It held space for mourning. It absorbed the tension of the day. Around it, people processed the unspoken. Silent stares across coals, shared sighs, the kind of communication that only happens when words fail, but presence remains. Evidence of this emotional dimension is harder to find in the archaeological record, but not impossible. Hearths at sites like Dolní Věstonice in Moravia, dating back 26,000 years before the Common Era, are surrounded by artefacts that suggest not just subsistence but symbolic activity. Figurines, ornaments, ochre-stained stones. The proximity of art and fire is no coincidence. The two go together not because of light alone, but because of what light represents. Illumination, warmth, meaning. The hearth was also the Paleolithic psychiatrist. Night brought fears of predators, of death, of dreams, but in the circle of firelight these anxieties were shared. Laughter diffused tension, story transformed terror into narrative. One of the oldest functions of myth is to make the unbearable bearable. The fire didn't banish darkness, it contextualized it. It let you name the thing crouched beyond the trees. This was nightlife with no club, no clock, no crowd. It was intimate, embodied, and ancient. There was no entertainment industry, only interpersonal awe. The stars were not obscured by light pollution. The smoke rose straight into the Milky Way. And in that alignment, people felt themselves part of something more. The fire wasn't just central physically. It was cosmologically symbolic, a sun brought to earth, a centre that burned but didn't blind. Children listened. Elders spoke, middle generations sharpened blades and fixed straps and occasionally nodded off. The group oscillated between silence and speech, music and maintenance. There was no program, no bedtime. Time flowed with the flames. When the coals dimmed, sleep came not always in beds, but close to kin, wrapped in hides, heartbeat to heartbeat. Even the remains of ancient ash layers tell us something. Their consistency, depth, and composition suggest repeated use nights upon nights, years upon years. The hearth was rebuilt, but always in the same place. A scorched circle, a memory marker. It told future returners, here is where we became human again. So when we ask what they did at night in the year 10,000 before the Common Era, the answer is not less than us. It is more. They remembered each other. They watched flames reflect in eyes. They turned fear into music and silence into connection. Theirs was not a nightlife of noise, but of necessity. It was not primitive. It was essential. The fire was not just the centre of camp, it was the centre of the world, and everything human story, music, love, grief circled it endlessly. By the time night fell across the plains and forests of the year 10,000 before the Common Era, fire had become more than a source of warmth. It was, in every sense, the calendar, the heartbeat, the shrine, and the memory of the world. Time in this world did not tick forward in numbers, but spiralled slowly through cycles. The moon waxed and waned, the rains came and left, berries ripened and vanished, and the sun returned, always from the east. The Paleolithic mind did not separate time from place or ritual from rhythm. The world was a breathing circle, and at its warmest centre was fire. Before the invention of clocks, calendars, and written language, people marked time through lived experience, and fire was its most dependable metronome. Embers glowed through the night and reawakened at dawn. Flames punctuated mealtimes, stories, seasons, and lifespans. The fire's rhythm matched the bodies, flickering, digesting, resting, reigniting. In archaeological terms, long-standing hearths at places like Mezirich and Dolny Vestonis show layered ash strata that span generations. These were not temporary sparks, they were social anchors. The same fire tended, fed, respected for years, for lifetimes. But fire was more than chronological. It was metaphorical. It mirrored birth, growth, death, and renewal. A flame begins with breath, rises in power, consumes, fades, and eventually returns to earth as coal or ash. To the people of the Upper Paleolithic, this process was not incidental. It was meaningful. It explained the cycle of life. As the flames danced, they told stories without words. This is why the oldest art, from Chauvet Cave to Blombos ochre carvings, is found close to fire sites. Illumination was physical, but also symbolic. It allowed minds to project. In the circular gatherings around fire, the group found more than visibility. They found belonging. Modern neuroscience now gives shape to what ancient people likely felt in their bones. Studies on oxytocin, the so-called bonding hormone, show spikes during shared storytelling, synchronized music, and mutual gaze, all common around the fire. These nighttime rituals fostered ambient safety, a psychological state where the body could relax, even in a dangerous world. No saber-toothed cat or winter storm could quite pierce the glow of a fire surrounded by kin. Trauma regulation too was practiced here, though they had no word for it. Around the fire, grief could be spoken, fear could be sung, anger could be mimed or danced. The body released tension through movement, sound, and the warm presence of others. The hearth was, neurologically speaking, a pre-modern therapy session. It regulated cortisol through communal care. The emotional brain limbic and reactive was soothed by flickering light, soft murmurs, and shared rhythm. Nighttime was medicine. This rhythm over time became memory. Stories weren't stored in books. They were kept alive in voices, passed along through repetition and variation. The repetition was not flaw, but feature. It embedded events into the group mind. The more often a tale was told, the more likely it would survive famine, migration, or generational loss. Fire made time visible. Each ring of listeners was a circle of timekeepers. Anthropologists studying present-day hunter-gatherers, like the Hadza of Tanzania, or the Juhwansi of the Kalahari, have found that nighttime fireside gatherings significantly differ from daytime behaviour. By day, information is utilitarian. Where is the water? What tracks are fresh? By night, however, narrative dominates. Myths, memories, taboos, laughter. Fire creates a temporal shift. It opens up the space for reflection, and that space shapes identity. The cognitive shift from linear to cyclical time is profound. In the fire's glow, time is not marching toward a future, but returning through memory. Elders become timekeepers. Children inherit not just names, but stories. The group becomes a living archive. This is not nostalgia. This is structure. Time is built from what is remembered, not from what is scheduled. The metaphor of fire also shaped rituals of death. Burial sites with traces of ochre, scorched stones, and charred offerings suggest that the end of life was not a termination, but a transformation. Fire, like death, changed matter without destroying it. It turned flesh to smoke, presence to absence, but never to nothing. In this way, time after death was not silence, but reverberation. The dead were remembered around the fire. Their names, their jokes, their gestures, they became part of the rhythm. And that rhythm echoed through design. Circular hearths, circular dance paths, circular camps. Even temporary dwellings were arranged with the fire in the middle. This was not just practical, it was cosmological. The fire was the sun at the heart of the human solar system. Every gesture, every conversation revolved around its pulse. In symbolic terms, the hearth was the first temple, not built of stone but of attention. Modern psychology now supports what ancient intuition practiced. Attention narrows around a fire. Heart rates lower. Breathing slows. The flickering light creates a meditative state. Some theorists even suggest that firelight helped shape human consciousness not through utility, but through trance. The gentle randomness of flame activates the default mode network, the brain system responsible for daydreaming, memory, and self-awareness. Fire in this view was the first screen not because it showed content, but because it enabled reflection. In this sense, fire taught people not just how to survive the night, but how to imagine the world. It provided the context for abstraction, the transformation of experience into symbol. Through the lens of the flame, people connected ideas across time. They saw the stars and imagined paths. They saw their own faces lit and imagined gods. They saw the crackling wood and imagined change. Fire was the mirror of the mind. And so when the fire burned low and people lay down to sleep, they did not exit time. They re-entered it differently. Dreams came more easily, fears softened. The warmth of the coals beneath the hide, the rhythmic breathing of sleepers, the final hiss of sap from the firewood all reminded them that the world was not a linear march, but a return, a circle, a season, a song. So much of what we now call civilization grew from that soft orange glow. Before temples there were hearths. Before scrolls there were stories. Before clocks there were coals. And before history there was memory, kept alive not by empire or ink, but by flame and voice and time that moved not forward but inward. The fire was the axis, and all things human turned around it. Before we built walls, before we planted seeds, and long before we named ourselves civilized, we were already not alone. Somewhere in the slow-turning millennia before the Common Era, beneath birch trees and bone-coloured moons, another creature walked beside us. It was not summoned. It was not tamed by force. It was not bred into submission. It was the dog, and it arrived not through domination, but through something far more ancient: proximity, patience, and the shared pulse of survival. In the year 10,000 before the Common Era, on the frostbitten banks of rivers now forgotten, humans were still nomadic bands of hunters and gatherers. But archaeological sites like Bonn Oberkassel in modern-day Germany tell us that by this time we were already burying dogs not as offerings or tools, but as companions. At Bonn Oberkassel, the remains of a human and a dog were interred side by side, both with signs of care. The dog, notably, had survived a serious illness in life. Someone fed it, tended to it, and kept it alive. In evolutionary terms, that act was monumental. It meant we were not just tolerating the dog, we were healing it. Popular myths about domestication still echo with a tone of conquest, as if early humans whistled and as wolves came running. But what actually happened was slower, subtler. Most likely, a population of wolves began frequenting the edges of human campsites, drawn by scraps, warmth, and curiosity. The less aggressive individuals, the ones with more tolerant temperaments, were allowed to linger. Over generations, natural selection favoured the ones who could coexist. The early human bands, in turn, noticed their presence. Maybe they warned of danger, maybe they helped flush out prey, maybe they simply offered warmth beside the fire. This mutualism, a co-evolutionary dance, altered both species. Humans and dogs began shaping each other. Canine facial musculature evolved to produce more expressive communicative faces. Humans, through mirror neurons and oxytocin release, responded to those expressions. Eye contact between a dog and a human, as modern studies show, elevates bonding hormones in both. This was not just behavioural convenience, it was biochemical synchrony, a friendship written into the blood. To understand this relationship archaeologically, we look not just at bones, but at how those bones were worn. The wear patterns on ancient canine teeth suggest diets that mirror human diets. At sites like Ust-Paluy in Siberia, remains show that dogs were fed human food meat scraps, bone marrow, sometimes even cooked grains. Their stomachs, like ours, began to adapt. This is significant. Dogs began diverging from their wolf ancestors not just through behaviour but through digestion. We literally fed their evolution. But more than food was shared. There is compelling evidence that dogs participated in hunting. Their speed, scent and ability to corner prey made them invaluable partners. At some sites, tools and dog remains are found together in hunting zones, not just domestic ones. This suggests they were not pets waiting by the hearth. They were part of the hunt. Their utility went beyond the sentimental. They were collaborators, and collaboration required trust. That trust, however, was not unconditional. Early human bands did not own dogs. They coexisted with them. The leash, the kennel, the command voice, these are much later inventions. What existed in 10,000 before the Common Era was likely far more fluid. Dogs could come and go, they could follow a band for a season and disappear, but while the partnership lasted, it altered the shape of life. Dogs provided security, companionship, and warmth. In return, they received food, protection, and place. This mutualism is supported by burial practices. The Bon Ober castle dog was laid to rest with grave goods, suggesting symbolic value. In other sites, dogs are buried alone, in curled sleeping positions, as if still resting by the fire. These are not signs of livestock disposal, they are signs of mourning. The humans who buried these dogs did so with ritual. That means memory, that means emotion, that means love. What's fascinating is how this early relationship may have shaped the human mind. The presence of a loyal, non-verbal, emotionally attuned companion may have reinforced certain cognitive traits, empathy, anticipation, symbolic thinking. A dog responds to tone, gaze, movement. A child growing up with such a creature learns subtlety in communication. This is not trivial. It is developmental. It is cultural. Ethnographic parallels abound. Among the San people of southern Africa, dogs assist in tracking and share food directly from the fire. Among Arctic groups, dogs were both sled pullers and family members, often sleeping inside shelters. In both cases, dogs are not tools, they are woven into the pattern of life. They help, they eat, they are named. This closeness is unique. No other animal joined us so early or so intimately. Livestock came later, after the agricultural revolution. Cats arrived not as partners in the hunt, but as controllers of grain pests. The dog alone stepped into our lives before we settled, before we fenced land, before we built gods, and once inside that circle of fire, they never really left. In this light, the phrase man's best friend flattens the story. It suggests ownership, hierarchy, loyalty on demand. But in the Paleolithic world it was different. It was a friendship of choice, not command. The dog did not submit. It chose proximity, and the human did not command. They offered space. It is possible too that this relationship helped us survive. During the long migrations out of Africa, through Ice Age Europe and across the land bridges of Asia, dogs were scouts, guards, and companions. Their presence made camps more alert and sleep more secure. They warned of predators, scavenged the remains, and kept the children company. They were not just there for the good times. They were there for the hunger, the cold, the grief. In this sense, we did not domesticate the dog. We found each other in the wild, and in that finding we changed each other forever. Our brains, our hearts, our cultures bear the imprint. The bones left in the ground speak not of conquest but of cooperation. And in a world where so much of history is war and power and loss, this chapter, the one lit by firelight shaped by pause and whispers, deserves to be remembered. The dog did not become human, but in many ways it helped us become more human, more empathetic, more watchful, more communal. It curled at our feet not as a servant, but as a mirror. And what it reflected was something soft, warm, and shared. So when we look back to 10,000 before the Common Era, let us not see only spears and stone tools. Let us see the quiet silhouette beside the hearth. Let us see the first wag of a tail that meant I see you, I know you, I choose to stay. Before the plough, before the pyramid, before we thought to write down the name of a king or carve the corner of a god, we painted animals in ochre, in charcoal, in manganese black and hematite red. On the belly of limestone caves, we left behind not crops or conquests, but creatures. Bulls with colossal shoulders, deer with exaggerated grace, rhinos mid-charge, horses in blurred motion. These were not idle doodles, they were declarations. Something in the animal had power. Something in the act of painting it, repeating it, remembering it, returning to it, gave shape to a soul we hadn't yet named. And for thousands of years before agriculture, before temples, before writing, the most sophisticated art humans produced was a gallery of beasts. In the great vaults of Lascaux and Chauvet in France, and the haunting depths of Sulawesi in Indonesia, we find these animal gods not labelled, not explained, but luminous. Chauvet, dated to around 30,000 years before the Common Era, holds some of the oldest and most exquisite examples of cave painting ever discovered. Here the walls breathe with lions, panthers, bison and mammoth stories painted with shading, perspective and dynamic movement. These were not the naive scribbles of survivalists. These were aesthetic acts, symbolic acts, ritual acts. Some scholars have compared them to altars, others to prayers. The Lascaux caves, slightly younger at around 17,000 years before the Common Era, offer even more elaborate scenes. Horses gallop in herds. A great black bull towers over the viewer, dwarfing all human presence. In one of the most puzzling panels, we see a bird-headed human figure beside a wounded bison, a rare depiction of the human form, and a hint that the division between species may not have been drawn as sharply in the Paleolithic mind as it is in ours. This hybrid, this shapeshifter, appears not as a hunter or conqueror, but as part of the same spiritual ecology. The paintings in Sulawesi, on the other side of the world, echo the same themes. One panel, over 40,000 years old, shows what may be the earliest known narrative seen human-animal hybrids engaging in what looks like a hunt. The figures are elongated, surreal and symbolic. Some have tails, others wear beaks or snouts. These are not realistic portrayals, they are myth in motion. Why did these early humans spend so much time and risk painting deep inside caves, often in total darkness, in chambers accessible only by crawling through narrow passages? These were not dwellings. There were no hearths, no sleeping mats, no trash pits. These were ritual spaces, memory vaults, cathedrals made of stone and silence. One theory suggests that the act of entering the cave itself was symbolic, a return to the womb of the earth, a descent into the unconscious, a rite of passage. The flickering torchlight animated the animals. They moved as the fire moved. In this view, the cave painting was not static art. It was cinema, performance, trance. The role of animals in these rituals was not incidental. The creatures painted were often those most important to the human, diet reindeer, aurochs, horses, but they were rarely shown being hunted. Instead, they appear majestic, untouchable, sacred. Some show no signs of violence at all. It is as if to paint them was not to dominate them, but to become them, or to ask their permission. This gives rise to the theory of animism, the belief that all things, including animals, rocks, rivers and wind, possess a spirit. In many contemporary hunter-gatherer cultures, animism remains the foundational world-view. The San of southern Africa, for example, tells stories of animal tricksters and shapeshifters who blur the line between species. Among the Ojibwe of North America, dreams of animals are considered sacred messages. These beliefs likely stretch back into the Paleolithic. In that world, the line between animal and human, body and spirit, was porous. The presence of therianthropes, beings that are part human, part animal, strengthens this interpretation. The so-called sorcerer figure in the cave of Trois Frères in France, painted around 13,000 years before the Common Era, is a classic example. He has antlers, the tail of a wolf, and the limbs of a man. Some interpret this as a shamanic figure, someone in trance, merging with the spirit of the beast. Others see it as mythic representation, a god or ancestor who wore many forms. Either way, it reveals a psychology of transformation. In this view, the cave was not a place to watch animals, but to become them. To embody their grace, their strength, their knowledge, the act of painting was a kind of sympathetic magic. By rendering the creature, you entered its essence. You honoured it, summoned it, or asked it to forgive you for taking its life. There are echoes of this in contemporary hunting rituals, where apology, song and offerings accompany the kill. This symbolic complexity has puzzled anthropologists for decades. Why would foragers, people supposedly preoccupied with survival, invest so much energy in abstraction? But the assumption itself is flawed. For Paleolithic humans, survival and symbolism were not separate domains. Knowing the land, tracking prey, reading weather signs all required pattern recognition, memory and abstraction. The mind that could follow a trail through snow could also follow a metaphor through pigment. Moreover, the timing of this art is telling. The explosion of symbolic activity, including figurines, beads, burial rituals, and cave paintings, begins around 50,000 years before the Common Era, during what scholars call the cognitive revolution. This was not the invention of intelligence, but the awakening of imagination. Something changed. Perhaps it was a mutation in the foxpew gene linked to language. Perhaps it was a threshold of population density that allowed cultural traditions to flourish. Whatever the cause, art appeared, and with it, a new mode of being human. And this art was overwhelmingly about animals, not landscapes, not people, not abstract shapes. The beasts came first. Even in Venus figurines, those curvaceous female statuettes found across Eurasia, we see traces of animal features or animal associations in context. The human form, when it appears, is often hybridized, masked, or incomplete. It is as if the self was still forming, still half beast and half spirit. In this context, the idea that humans were the crown of creation would have seemed bizarre. If anything, the animals were the crown. They led the way. They carried the stories. They returned in dreams. They lined the cave walls larger than life, reminding us not of our dominion, but of our dependence, and that dependence was emotional as well as practical. Watching a herd of aurochs move across the horizon was not just a tactical observation. It was awe, it was reverence. The sound of hoofbeats echoed in the ribcage. The breath of a predator froze the lungs. The intimacy was physical. To be alive was to be alert to animal presence, to tracks, sounds, patterns, movements. The animal was not an object, it was a sign. So when we look at these ancient paintings, we should not ask, what were they trying to say, as if we could translate them like a text. We should ask, what were they trying to feel? What kind of world requires the deer to be painted over and over again, in the same place with the same curve of muscle and tilt of horn? What kind of memory lives not in words, but in pigment? The mystery remains. We cannot know the exact rituals, the chants, the thoughts behind the hand that traced a horse across the stone. But we can know this, the act mattered. It was repeated. It was passed down. It was returned to. And that makes it sacred. Long before religion there was reverence. Long before language there was line. Long before civilization there was the animal and the human, watching, listening, breathing in time. The gods of the first world had fur and claws and eyes that glinted in the dark, and we painted them, not to possess them, but to remember what we were before we forgot. High atop a ridge in southeastern Anatolia, long before the wheel, the plough, or the written word, someone carved a circle from stone, a circle of monoliths, each weighing several tons, arranged with an intelligence that should not exist yet, not here, not in a world without cities, without scripts, without even pottery. This is Göbekli Tepe, and it has no right to exist in the 12th millennium before the Common Era, and yet it does, buried deliberately under its own ruins and left for us to find, as if the Earth itself had decided to keep the memory secret until we were ready to remember. Discovered in the mid-1990s and radiocarbon dated to nearly 12,000 years ago, Göbekli Tepe shattered every tidy narrative of human progress. It predates Stonehenge by over 6 millennia, and the Egyptian pyramids by at least 7. But unlike those later marvels, Göbekli Tepe was not built by settled agriculturalists or hierarchical priesthoods. It was built by nomads, foragers, hunter-gatherers, people who, according to conventional archaeology, should have been too busy chasing gazelle and tubers to raise any monument taller than a walking stick. But here, into the shadow of the Taurus Mountains, they carved sandstone pillars over 16 feet high. They decorated them with reliefs of foxes, snakes, vultures, scorpions, and headless men, and they arranged them into concentric enclosures whose symbolic logic we are only beginning to grasp. There is no evidence of domestic architecture at Göbekli Tepe. No homes, no hearths, no signs of year-round habitation. What we find instead are T-shaped pillars arranged in circular or oval spaces, often with a pair of central monoliths dominating the design. These twin stones may have represented humans, gods, ancestors, or all three. Their arms are carved along the sides, fingers clasp in front. They stand not as objects but as presences, and around them smaller stones stand like silent witnesses, each inscribed with animals that seem to float in symbolic sequence. The site is not defensive, nor is it residential, it is ceremonial. A temple perhaps, but without a city. A sanctuary with no population centre. A shrine for people on the move. The builders of Göbekli Tepe had no wheels, no beasts of burden, and no metal tools. But they moved and shaped tons of stone. They planned enclosures with mathematical precision, suggesting a knowledge of spatial memory and geometry far ahead of its time. This has led some scholars to suggest the site functioned as a kind of calendar, perhaps tracking the movement of celestial bodies, solstices, or seasonal migrations. Others interpret it as a place of burial or ancestral veneration. Still others propose initiation rituals, feasting grounds, or healing ceremonies. The truth may be all of these, or none, but one thing is clear. These people gathered here not to survive, but to mean something. And that meaning was carved in the language of animals. The reliefs are not random. The fox, which appears repeatedly, may have held totemic significance, a mediator between worlds, a cunning guide. Snakes slither across stone as symbols of death, rebirth, or danger. Vultures, associated with death in the sky in later Neolithic sites like Çatalhöyük, may have been messengers or soul carriers. The prevalence of headless human figures suggests a ritual relationship with mortality, echoing practices in other early sites where skull removal or curation played a symbolic role. These were not just decorations, they were stories in stone, mnemonic anchors for a culture that remembered in images, not texts. But how and why would a mobile, non-sedentary group invest so much effort in such a structure? That question has haunted archaeologists. One answer is that the act of building itself was sacred, that the gathering, the carving, the coordination of labour was the ritual. There is evidence of massive feasts at Göbekli Tepe animal bones in abundance, especially gazelle and aurochs, some butchered with astonishing care. These were not subsistence meals, they were communal events, ceremonial consumption, meat shared beneath monoliths, memories sealed in muscle and marrow. This changes the assumed sequence of human development. For decades, the dominant theory ran in a straight line. Agriculture begat surplus, surplus begat cities, cities begat temples. Göbekli Tepe flips that sequence. Here it may have been the need to gather and worship, to commemorate, to ritualize that encouraged people to stay longer, to plant a few seeds, to domesticate a goat or two. The temple, not the farm, came first. The sacred did not emerge from settlement. Settlement may have emerged from the sacred. And yet Göbekli Tepe was not eternal. After centuries of use, perhaps over 1,000 years, its enclosures were deliberately buried. Layer after layer of backfill, composed of limestone rubble, flint tools and broken animal bones, sealed off the sacred spaces. Whether this was an act of reverence, of forgetting, or of ritual closure remains unknown. But it ensured the site's survival. Had it not been entombed, it might have eroded away unnoticed. Instead, it was preserved like a fossil of meaning, waiting to re-emerge. The site's sudden appearance, sophistication, and eventual burial have fed both scholarly wonder and speculative mythology. Some fringe theories invoke lost civilizations, extraterrestrial knowledge, or Atlantean priesthoods. But the real mystery is richer. Göbekli Tepe forces us to rethink what early humans were capable of, not in terms of tools, but of thought. These were not crude survivalists. They were artists, engineers, symbol makers, and memory keepers. They were humans who looked at stone and saw story. The wider implications are profound. If hunter-gatherers could cooperate on such monumental projects, it suggests that the emotional and cognitive frameworks for civilization were already in place long before domestication. Empathy, coordination, shared myth, and spiritual imagination did not wait for cities. They were there, in the blood and the breath of nomadic bands, shaping stone into meaning. Even now, only a fraction of Göbekli Tepe has been excavated. Ground-penetrating radar suggests dozens more enclosures lie beneath the surface untouched. Each one might hold another piece of the puzzle, another beast in bas-relief, another circle of presence. But already the message is clear. In the 12th millennium before the Common Era, before farming, before government, before any recognizable system of power, humans gathered in the shadow of carved animals and remembered something together. What they remembered or what they invented remains open to interpretation. But the act of gathering, of carving, of witnessing has endured. Göbekli Tepe is not the first temple, it is the first known temple, and it suggests that the need for meaning is older than the need for mastery. Long before we built walls, we built circles. Long before we stored grain, we stored stories in stone. And long before we named gods, we walked among them teeth bared, tails curled, etched forever into the bedrock of memory. They buried it, layer by layer, stone by stone, as if trying to seal something inside or protect something from being forgotten. In the 11th millennium before the Common Era, a group of nomads deliberately entombed a temple they had once gathered to build, feed around, dance in, and perhaps grieve inside. Göbekli Tepe, the oldest known ritual structure on Earth, was not destroyed by time or conquest or erosion. It was buried on purpose, and no one knows why. The burial of Göbekli Tepe is not a slow weathering, nor an accidental collapse. It is methodical. The circular enclosures, once lined with towering T-shaped pillars carved with foxes, vultures, snakes, and mythic creatures, were filled with limestone rubble and compacted sediment. Bones, broken tools, and fragments of art were mixed in, like memories sealed in a time capsule. This backfill wasn't dumped in haste. It was layered. It was intentional. And that alone should make us pause, because it was not just a structure that they buried. It was a world view, a way of relating to the world that was circular, mobile, animistic, and impermanent. They buried the temple, perhaps, to bury the time before walls. Archaeologists debate the motivations. Was the burial a kind of closure, a ceremonial act that marked the end of a cycle? Some suggest it may have been a way to retire a sacred site that had completed its purpose. Like a prayer folded and hidden, or a sacred object placed back into the earth, Göbekli Tepe may have been ritually entombed to protect its power. But others see darker undertones. The 12th and 11th millennia before the Common Era were times of ecological flux. The Younger Dryas cold period had ended, ushering in a more stable Holocene climate. With that came changes in animal migrations, plant availability, and eventually the first experiments in agriculture. The burial of Göbekli Tepe may reflect a moment of grief, an elegy for a vanishing world. The foxes, so central to the symbolism of the site, were once abundant in the region, but may have become scarcer. The vultures, associated with death and transformation, could have signalled a cultural preoccupation with mortality in a time of environmental uncertainty. Some researchers propose that the burial marks an attempt to process trauma, the trauma of losing a way of life that had lasted tens of thousands of years. To bury something is to acknowledge its death, but it is also to preserve it. The act of covering Göbekli Tepe preserved it far better than if it had been left exposed. In its deliberate entombment, we glimpse a psychological depth often denied to ancient peoples. These were not mindless ritualists. They were meaning makers, capable of complex symbolic gestures. Burying the temple may have been the most eloquent gesture of all. Another theory suggests that burial served to reset the ritual landscape. In some traditional societies, once a sacred space has absorbed enough memory, enough sorrow, enough magic, enough transformation, it is considered complete. Rather than continue building atop exhausted sanctity, you close it, you cover it, and you begin anew. Göbekli Tepe, in this view, may not have been a singular sacred site, but part of a cycle of creation and burial, an evolving dialogue with the land. This matches the strange dream logic that often governs the sacred. In dreams, we bury things we cannot face. In myth, we bury things that must be reborn. In ritual, we bury things to anchor memory. And so the temple too was buried, like an idea too powerful to be left loose, like a myth you can only revisit when you forget. What we do know is that the people who buried Göbekli Tepe were not the same as those who built it. Generations had passed. The carving styles had changed. Some enclosures show more abstract designs than the earlier ones, perhaps indicating a shift in worldview. And then, abruptly, they filled them in, and they left. No later society reused the site. There is no evidence of reoccupation. The burial was final. It did not mark transition, but cessation. And this, perhaps, is what makes Göbekli Tepe so haunting. It is not just old, it is a monument to something lost. Was it the end of animism? Of a world where animals and humans shared spiritual space? Was it the moment humans began to see themselves as separate, as rulers rather than relatives? Some scholars argue that sites like Göbekli Tepe mark the boundary between Paleolithic being and Neolithic, control between living within the rhythms of the land and seeking to master them. If so, the burial is more than practical. It is symbolic rebellion or reluctant farewell, a way of laying to rest a form of consciousness that no longer fit the emerging order, a consciousness rooted in cycles, reciprocity and impermanence. The enclosure walls of Göbekli Tepe were not defensive. They were porous, relational. The pillars, with their carved arms and anthropomorphic silhouettes, do not dominate. They participate. The animals do not threaten. They accompany. This was not architecture of ownership, it was architecture of encounter. And to bury that is to bury a form of life, the kind that doesn't leave ruins, the kind that isn't tracked by conquest or commerce, the kind that remembers the fox as a spirit, not a pest, the kind that looks at stone and sees a mirror. Even the archaeological process mirrors this drama. Each layer excavated is a reversal of burial, a return, but what we uncover may never fully reveal what was intended. Symbols resist translation. Memory is not a photograph, it is sediment. In the end, the burial of Göbekli Tepe may be the most human act of all. To build is one thing, to bury is another. We bury what we love, what we fear, what we wish to preserve, what we cannot carry forward. And so in the 11th millennium before the Common Era, they covered their carved gods and foxes and myths in limestone and silence, and they walked away, leaving us a question, not an answer. A temple without a city, a prayer sealed in dust, and a truth that still burns beneath the stones. There is a story we keep telling ourselves, that the day we planted wheat was the day we began to rise, that when we traded the wandering life for fields, when we exchanged the wild grove for the fenced granary, we took a step forward into civilization, into progress, into the dawn of history. But what if the seeds we sowed were laced with sorrow? What if, along with wheat, we cultivated anxiety? Not all at once, not in a single season, but quietly over centuries. A slow trade, mystery for management, rhythm for repetition, memory for measurement. This is the trap that opened in the 10th millennium before the Common Era, when something irreversible began to shift in the hills and valleys of the Fertile Crescent. In the archaeological layers of places like Çatalhöyük and Jericho, we find the remnants of that shift. Storehouses, mud brick homes, walls that hold and divide. Here, humans stopped moving with the land and began to fix themselves to it. In doing so, they changed more than their diets. They changed their minds. Sedentism. The choice to stay in one place and grow food altered how we thought, how we aged, how we fought, and how we imagined ourselves. It was not simply a choice to plant. It was the planting of a whole new paradigm. Before this, Paleolithic humans lived within cycles. They hunted and gathered with knowledge passed through story and gesture. Their diet was rich and varied. Tubers, fish, fruits, nuts, eggs, honey, wild game. Studies of dental calculus and isotopic analysis from pre-agricultural sites show excellent nutrition and low incidence of disease. Their days were structured by light, weather, season, and need not by clocks or quotas. They did not own land, nor did they wall it. Social structures were fluid, with prestige earned more by charisma or skill than accumulation. Death came, but not always with hierarchy. Burial sites from the Paleolithic show minimal signs of inequality. But in the Neolithic, that began to change. With agriculture came surplus, and with surplus came storage, and with storage came the need to guard, to distribute, to account. This was the birth of stress. Crops fail, rodents come, neighbours steal. A bad season could mean hunger, no matter how full the granary had once been. Anxiety entered the calendar, and along with it, labour. Paleolithic hunter-gatherers worked less than you might expect, often fewer hours per week than the modern office employee. Foraging, hunting, processing and tool maintenance were intensive but not constant. There was rest, there was storytelling, there were seasonal shifts. In contrast, early agriculturalists worked longer hours with more repetitive motion. Sowing, weeding, harvesting, grinding. Skeletal remains from Neolithic communities show signs of repetitive stress injuries, arthritis, and deteriorated dental health from grain-heavy diets. Malnutrition became common even in the age of abundance. The irony of the Neolithic is that food became more secure, but nutrition became poorer. And then came walls. Jericho, in what is now the West Bank, boasts one of the oldest known city walls, dated to around the 9th millennium before the Common Era. Its tower and fortifications imply not just settlement, but threat. With land ownership comes land defence, with storage comes invasion. The wall is not merely architecture, it is a psychology, a boundary, a shift in how we perceive space, people and danger. Çatalhöyük, in central Anatolia, flourished around the 8th millennium before the Common Era. It is a city with no streets. Homes are packed tightly together, accessed by ladders from the roofs. Inside we find murals, sculptures, domestic shrines, and a striking blend of beauty and containment. But we also find evidence of conflict. Rooms built over graves, layers of soot and plastered skulls. The dead were buried beneath the floors. Life and death were no longer separated by forests or distance. They shared a wall. Status too found a new footing in the Neolithic. In forager societies, status is often situational and mutable. In settled societies, it ossifies. Wealth can be stored, inheritance becomes a factor, inequality finds a foothold. Archaeological digs from Neolithic settlements show disparities in grave goods, housing sizes, and access to resources. The egalitarianism of mobile bands begins to erode under the weight of stored grain and sedentary life. But perhaps the deepest change was psychological. Agriculture demanded planning, scheduling, and control. The cycles of wild food were replaced by the artificial rhythms of sowing and harvest. Time became something to manage, not to follow. Anxiety became chronic. What if the rains do not come? What if locusts arrive? What if our neighbour's field yields more? Where Paleolithic people had danced with the unpredictability of the wild, Neolithic people tried to outmaneuver it. And what of the sacred? Paleolithic art is expansive, symbolic, full of mystery. Animal forms, hybrid spirits, swirling ochre patterns. But in Neolithic contexts, art becomes more domestic, more geometric. Gods become administrators. The divine shifts from animistic encounter to hierarchical presence. Shrines in Çatalhöyük are filled with bull skulls and fertility symbols. The wild is brought indoors, mounted, contained. It is the taming not just of animals, but of imagination. This is not to say the Neolithic was a mistake. Without it, we would have no cities, no writing, no history as we know it. But it is to say that the shift was not purely a gain. It was a trade-off, and it came with costs we still pay. Even our bodies bear the memory. Shrinking stature, more cavities, more pathogens. With dense populations came disease, measles, smallpox, influenza. Many of our major diseases arose from proximity to domesticated animals and human waste. Sedentary life meant exposure, not just to the elements, but to each other. And with exposure came epidemics. So why did we do it? Why plant wheat and not just keep foraging? One answer is necessity. As populations grew and climate changed, wild food sources became harder to predict. Farming offered a kind of insurance. Another answer is spiritual. Sites like Göbekli Tepe suggest that the urge to gather, to ritualize, to create sacred space may have preceded farming and even led to it. Perhaps we began to settle not because of food, but because of meaning. Because we needed to return to the same place, to bury our dead, to tell our stories, to build our circles of stone. In this view, the Neolithic trap was not a sudden fall from Eden. It was a slow weaving of roots into soil, a shift from relationship to possession, from moving with the land to making it serve us, from being of the world to standing apart from it. And now, 10,000 years later, we live surrounded by the consequences. Our food systems, our calendars, our stress, our architecture all bear the imprint of that long ago shift. But so too does our memory. The yearning for simpler rhythms, for a life that moves with the light, for food that doesn't come wrapped in plastic, these too are echoes. We are not separate from the foragers. Their bones are our bones. Their choices are our inheritance. And their worries, perhaps, were not so different. Because the day we planted wheat, we planted worry. Not because we were foolish, but because we were human. Because even then, we were chasing something more than calories. We were chasing permanence. And permanence, it turns out, is heavy. It needs walls. It needs plans. It needs gods that do not leave. But the land remembers the rhythm. And so do we. In the beginning, time did not tick. It circled, it pulsed, it sang through the seasons and braided itself into wind patterns, animal migrations, and the moonlit logic of memory. But somewhere between the soft dawn of the 8th millennium before the Common Era and the sharp outlines of what we now call civilization, time changed. It stopped being something you felt and became something you feared. It became a column, a schedule, a shadow cast by the grain silo and the tax ledger. And though wheat may have nourished our growing populations, it also seeded something more invisible, the calendar, and with it, the collapse of the mythic mind. For tens of thousands of years, time was mythological. The rains returned because a god wept. The antlers grew back because the ancestors remembered. Stories explained seasons, and memory was measured in repetition, not in units. But with the Neolithic shift towards sedentism and agriculture, time began to fracture. The solar calendar emerged as a precision instrument for planting and harvesting. It was useful, it was necessary, but it was also a Trojan horse. Because to track time in this way linearly, numerically required a new kind of thinking, one that replaced reverence with regulation. At sites like Çatalhöyük in central Anatolia and Jericho near the Jordan River, we see the emergence of not just permanent architecture, but permanent accounting. Schedules had to be kept, grain had to be measured, Walls were no longer metaphor, they were mud brick, and they marked both place and time. The spatial became temporal. You lived not in the cycle of stories, but in the daily demands of production. And as agriculture spread, so too did this new consciousness, one in which the sun was no longer a deity, but a clock, and the moon a bureaucratic assistant. In Mesopotamia, the clay tablet emerged as the first administrative memory, not to record epics or dreams, but to tally grain and sheep. The earliest known writing system, cuneiform, was not born to celebrate myth, it was born to inventory labour, to allocate rations, to record tax obligations. By the late 4th millennium before the Common Era, city-states like Uruk were issuing ration tokens, and temple economies had become complex systems of intake and redistribution. The temple, once a place for cosmological alignment, became a tax office with incense. This transformation affected cognition itself. To live by the calendar was to become conscious of debt, of lateness, of aging. The mythic time that once offered endless returns of spring, of death and rebirth, of grandmother stories that looped through generations began to give way to finality, to deadlines, to progress. There was a radical compression of human narrative, from the cyclical to the linear, from the participatory to the managerial. Even the oldest temples bear witness to this slow erosion of mythic perception. At Nabta Playa, deep in the Nubian desert, stone circles mark astronomical alignments from as early as the 5th millennium before the Common Era. These were still sacred, still symbolic, but they also foreshadowed a new sensibility, one that tied the heavens to planting schedules. The sky became a ledger, a countdown, a framework for control, and with control came borders. The invention of territory required maps, and maps required dates. When to plant, when to harvest, when to collect. By the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, we see this solidifying into formal calendars, the Egyptian civil calendar with its 12 months of 30 days, the Babylonian lunar calendar coordinated with solar observations. Time became a grid, and you a dot inside it. The psychological effect was profound. People became schedulable. Labour became hourly. The shift from myth to metric compressed experience. A story that once unfolded across fireside nights and starlit migrations now had to fit within seasonal quotas and administrative expectations. Narrative was no longer a social glue, it was a means of instruction, a tool for conformity. Even myths were edited, streamlined and synchronized with official cosmologies that justified political control. Kings claimed divine descent not for poetry's sake, but to coordinate tribute. The sacred calendar became an institution. The solstice festival became tax season, and with it came stress. Studies of early agricultural populations show increasing signs of physiological strain-stunted growth. Tooth decay, spinal injuries, signs of chronic malnutrition. The calendar kept everyone on track, but it also kept them in line. Sedentary life made time predictable, and that predictability allowed for its manipulation. You could be late, you could be early, you could fail to meet your quota. And so, linear time required consequence, and consequence required enforcement. Bureaucracies grew not only out of necessity, but out of fear. Fear that someone would not meet their share, that memory alone was no longer enough to bind a community. Surveillance replaced storytelling. Inspection replaced initiation. And the oral mind, rich in symbol and ambiguity, gave way to the quantifiable, the extractable, the administratively relevant. This was not a conspiracy. It was a transition, but it was not neutral. The shift to calendar consciousness narrowed the bandwidth of what counted as real. Myth, dream, trance, metaphor. These became secondary, decorative. The body still knew how to feel seasonal change, but the mind was now attuned to units. Days, weeks, years, and soon, debt cycles, work hours, lifespans divided into quarters, childhood, productivity, retirement, death. We began to see ourselves not as participants in a vast storied world, but as producers in a timed economy. The mythic mind, which once found presence in every stone and story, was repurposed into machinery. Ritual became habit, spirit became statistic, and time, once a warm, wandering creature, was now a cold, forward line. But even in this transformation, we can find echoes of what came before. Some early calendars retained their poetic residue. The Mayan long count encoded mythic cycles. The Vedic cosmology folded time into nested yugas. Even the Christian liturgical calendar, for all its rigidity, weaves story and rhythm together. Yet these are ghosts of the older perception silhouettes against the bureaucratic ski. So what collapsed was not time itself, but our intimacy with it, our mythic partnership. The old stories did not die, they were overwritten, buried like Göbekli Tepe, and in their place rose a new architecture, of control, of clarity, of countdown. We could measure everything except the meaning we lost. Somewhere inside your skull, between the flicker of a notification and the whisper of an ancient craving, lives a brain that thinks the world is still made of fur and firelight. It does not know what TikTok is. It does not care for quarterly earnings, infinite scroll, or abstract symbols on a glowing screen. Your brain, for all its modern upgrades and performative sophistication, is 99% Paleolithic, and that 1% is struggling to keep up. Let's start with a sobering truth. Your nervous system was not built for the 21st century. It was sculpted across hundreds of thousands of years to respond to a rhythm of life that no longer exists. It expects a world where threats are tactile, where food is intermittent, where meaning comes through presence and time moves in circles. But instead it's trapped in an environment of artificial urgency, overwhelming abundance and fractal isolation. That mismatch is the source of more suffering than we dare to admit. Modern neuroscience confirms what ancient bones suspected. Our baseline neurology is optimized for the slow, sensory-rich world of hunter-gatherers. In that world, attention was a life-preserving instrument tracking a rustle in the grass, reading facial micro-expressions, synchronizing with the seasons. Our dopamine systems, calibrated to scarcity and effort, evolved to reward incremental success, the finding of a route, the touch of another hand, the rhythm of walking back to camp with meat for the fire. Today, those same systems are short-circuited. They are flooded by hyper-palatable stimuli, likes, ads, headlines, drama. They are teased by artificial cues and denied the embodied reward of real movement, real community, real pattern. This is not a moral failing, it is a neurological betrayal, and it explains why so many people feel anxious for no reason or exhausted by tasks that should be simple. The prefrontal cortex, our rational pilot, is constantly overridden by deeper circuits that believe we are still in the wild. Every ding from a phone is interpreted as urgent. Every ambiguous social cue is potential exile. Every absence of meaning feels like death. Let us be specific. The limbic system, the emotional and motivational core of the brain, processes social belonging with the same urgency it once reserved for predators. The threat of disconnection from the tribe once meant literal death. Now it's just an unanswered message or a silent room, but the physiological response is the same. Cortisol, inflammation, panic. Your brain does not know the difference between being ghosted and being left behind on the savannah. We also see the mismatch in sleep. Paleolithic humans lived by the light of fire and the pulse of moon and star. Their circadian rhythms followed the sun. Melatonin surged in the dark. They slept in short phases, often communally, with waking moments for feeding infants or tending embers. Today we blast our retinas with blue light until midnight, sleep alone in temperature-controlled cubes, and wonder why rest eludes us. Our ancestors fell asleep to cricket choruses and woke to bird cries. We fall asleep to algorithms and wake to alarms. Even the way we move is misaligned. Our bodies evolved for a lifestyle of slow, constant motion for walking, squatting, lifting, for crafting and carrying and cooking. Today's sedentary culture, punctuated by artificial bursts of gym intensity, confuses the body and disrupts hormonal balance. Movement was once embedded in meaning. Now it's scheduled, measured, performed. Then there is loneliness. The Paleolithic world was one of perpetual proximity. Children were raised by bands, not pairs. Elders lived near fires, not in facilities. Touch was constant. Voices were familiar. Eye contact was part of daily navigation. Today, we live in isolated boxes, surrounded by strangers, feeding our longing for connection through flickering simulations. But oxytocin, the neurochemical of trust and bonding, cannot be triggered by pixels. It needs presence, it needs breath, it needs another human body in the room. And yet your brain remembers. Somewhere deep in your sensorium it knows what it means to be attuned. It longs for ritual, rhythm, community. A pattern out of life where meaning is not a spreadsheet but a shared silence. This is not nostalgia. It is biology. The ache you feel when staring at a screen too long, the anxiety that surges without cause, the craving for simplicity, for wildness, for something real, this is not regression. It is remembrance. We are not meant to romanticize the past. Life in the Paleolithic was hard. There was death, disease, hunger, cold, but it was real. And it made sense. And it shaped us. For over 99% of our species' existence, this was the norm. A human nervous system evolved to regulate itself through song, story, presence, and place. And when those anchors disappear, what replaces them clicks, clocks. Consumption does not satisfy. This does not mean we need to return to the caves, but it does mean we must stop pretending our pain is irrational. It is not. It is the cry of a system out of context. The anxiety, the disconnection, the burnout, these are not bugs in the software. They are signals from a Paleolithic core, still faithfully trying to keep you alive in a world that forgot how to listen. So what can be done? Begin with awareness, notice the mismatch, honour the design. Your body is not broken, it is misinterpreted, and it is doing its best. Seek rhythm, seek nature, seek presence, eat slowly, sit in circles, look people in the eye, let firelight dance across your vision, touch the ground, listen to old songs, tell your stories out loud. Because your brain is not a machine, it is an animal, an ancient one, and somewhere in its fur-covered memory, it still remembers what it means to be human, and so do you. In a world lit by LEDs and governed by seconds, something ancient still stirs in us when the power goes out and we light a single flame. The room hushes, the shadows breathe. And for reasons we can't quite explain, we feel safer, closer, more real. This isn't nostalgia. This is memory. Not personal memory, but the body's memory, the kind carved not in neurons but in the nervous system, layered deep over hundreds of thousands of years when the only light after sundown was firelight, and the only stories worth telling were the ones that kept you alive or gave you a reason to stay. Camping feels holy because it is, not because it's a vacation, but because it's a return. A return to unscripted hours, to eye contact that lasts longer than a glance, to food that takes time, to weather that matters. When we set up tents beneath trees and sit in circles, we're not escaping civilization, we're rehearsing something older. The fire flickering at the centre becomes the axis again, and around it we are no longer avatars or inboxes or productivity reports. We are just bodies with breath and memory, with ears for stories and hands for food. The ache that people feel after a camping trip or during a night without screens isn't inconvenience, it's homesickness. For nearly all of human history, slowness wasn't a lifestyle trend. It was simply life. The rhythms of breath, of footsteps, of chewing, of waiting for the sky to change colour. The world moved at the speed of digestion and dusk. No one needed to schedule a dopamine detox or block out time for mindfulness. Attention was full, because distraction could kill you. The rustle in the grass wasn't just noise, it might be dinner or danger. And every decision carried the weight of consequence, but also the reward of presence. Our brains are still wired for this. For proximity, not distance, for presence, not performance, for meaning that unfolds, not content that refreshes. The neocortex may have evolved its abstract capabilities in the last few tens of thousands of years, but the limbic system, the emotional social brain, is much older. It remembers the village even if you don't. It flares when you're isolated. It calms when you're touched. It warms when you're seen. That's not weakness. That's the evolutionary wisdom of a species that survived not by being the fastest or strongest, but by being the most bonded. We didn't evolve to be happy. We evolved to belong. Belonging meant survival. A lone human on the savannah wasn't a romantic hero. They were dead. But a band, a circle, a shared rhythm of labour and laughter and mutual reliance that was strength. Today, we pathologize our symptoms, anxiety, disconnection, burnout as if they are personal failures. But in truth they are mismatches. Our Paleolithic nervous systems are being asked to process a post-industrial onslaught of stimuli, schedules and separations, and they are simply waving the red flag. When you light a candle and speak quietly, something shifts. You've noticed it. The room becomes a little more real. The space around your skin softens. It's not just mood lighting, it's nervous system alchemy. Firelight triggers oxytocin release, lowers cortisol, narrows focus. Anthropologists have found that even simulated campfires on video reduce stress in modern viewers. The crackle, the warmth, the pulsing orange glow, these are not aesthetic flourishes. They are signals of safety, of group cohesion, of story time. And story time, for most of our history, was the heartbeat of culture. Before books, before scripts, before formal religion, we had the tale passed from mouth to mouth across firelight, etched into memory by rhythm, metaphor, and repetition. Boredom, once a gift, has become intolerable, but boredom is not a void, it is an invitation. A space where daydreaming arises, where memory stirs, where original thought crawls up from the silence. In the Paleolithic night, after the meals and the stories and the lull of coals, there was nothing left but stars and the shiver of wind. Children slept in piles. Elders sat and listened to nothing in particular. This was not a wasted hour. This was ancestral meditation. The psyche digested the day, and in that stillness, meaning brewed. Today, we numb that longing with novelty. Scroll, click, tap, refresh. But novelty without ritual is noise, and too much noise makes us forget what we came here to remember. That human intelligence wasn't born from speed or spectacle. It was born from slowness, from sync, from time spent together in shared silence and shared awe. Our greatest art, music, poetry, myth all arose from slowness and silence. The gods, if they ever came softly. What if that longing you feel late at night when the apartment is quiet and your chest aches for no reason isn't pathology? What if it's memory? What if your body is remembering something older than your name, a circle of people, a flame in the dark? The sound of breathing and the hush that meant listening was beginning? Maybe your insomnia isn't the failure of sleep. Maybe it's the memory of a world without clocks trying to find its way back. The invitation now is not to reconstruct the Paleolithic. It's to remember the shape of meaning, to light fires again, metaphorical or literal, to slow down not as resistance but as reverence, to reclaim silence not as absence but as presence, to tell stories not just for information but for transformation. The memory still lives in you, not as data, not as documentary, but as rhythm, as warmth, as the gravity of a circle and the beauty of the spoken word. You won't find this memory in textbooks, but you might find it when the lights go out and the room hushes and the first flame begins to flicker. And when that happens, don't reach for your phone, reach for your breath and listen, because the fire is speaking again, and it's been waiting a very long time.